Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here because I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about writing a personal narrative, since you will be writing a personal narrative for your first essay in this class. So first of all, a personal narrative. Narrative just means story. So it's a personal story. It's a story, it's a narrative constructed from events and details pulled from your own life, from your own experience. So it's just a story that you've lived, basically. That's what a personal narrative is. We can start by making a distinction between two different categories of personal narrative, that of memoir and that of autobiography. Now, we could also maybe mention some other categories. We could talk about diaries, and maybe anecdotes as its own category, roman à clef, which means a novel with a key. But let's leave all that to the side right now and just talk about these kind of two main central categories. So we'll go with autobiography first. So we all know that a biography is just a book that tells the story of a person's whole life, starting with their birth and moving through their upbringing, going through the key events of their life, and if they're dead, ending with their death, and maybe some epilogue of their legacy. If they're still alive, then it'll generally end by telling where they are now and what they're doing now. So an autobiography is the same thing, except it's written by someone. An autobiography is written by someone telling the story of their own life, more or less in its entirety. And that's kind of that's the first key thing that we can use to describe autobiography. It tells the story of a life in its entirety. So it's complete, or strives for a more complete portrait of the person's life, a more complete portrait of the shape of the person's whole life. And the next categorizing characteristic we might use is concrete. Autobiography tends to be more concrete in a way than memoir. Oh, by the way, as we go through this, bear in mind that these aren't hard set categories. There's a lot of fluidity and flux between these two categories. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish one from the other. You might even think of them as two different sides of a spectrum, two different ends of a spectrum. And most things will fall somewhere kind of in between. But just for the sake of thinking about it, let's make this distinction. So an autobiography, the first thing is it is more complete. It tends to be more concrete, which means it aims for more of a, I like to think of it as more of a photographic documentation. That is, what it is presenting is meant to be considered a kind of objective reality. I mean, there's no such thing as a purely objective autobiography. That's kind of impossible. And there's really no such thing as a purely objective biography. I mean, if you go to the library, say, and look for a biography of George Washington, you're going to find a whole bookcase full of them. So there's no real thing as a truly objective documentation of somebody's life. And there's all these different, the author, whether they're writing about themselves or writing about somebody else, they're selecting details from life because you cannot put every possible detail in. And if you're curious to see what it might look like if somebody tried to put every possible detail of their life into a book, you might look at a famous novel from the 18th century called The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, by Lawrence Sterne, which presents itself as a kind of autobiography of a fictional character, but it gets lost in digressions, and the narrator doesn't really get past his own birth. So that's a fun little book to look at, but it's a long one, but you should look at it at some point. But that's fiction. That's just kind of a spoof of what happens. If somebody tried to put all the details in, it's impossible. So an autobiography, it's more whole, more of a complete portrait. It aims for more concrete, more of a concrete picture. So it tries to be more exact with dates, more exact with names, places, especially quotes. If you're presented as some kind of objective photographic documentation as things that happened point for point, then an autobiography should tend to be more word perfect with its quotes. There's not a lot of leeway, because if you're saying that so and so said something, you don't want to put words in their mouth that they didn't say, especially with some kind of controversial issue of any kind. So we have more complete, more concrete. An autobiography will tend to be more chronological. So it'll usually, a lot of times you'll like a framing device where somebody is writing from their current state, and then they go back into their memory. Like Michelle Obama's Becoming does this. It starts out with her right after her family has left the White House, and then she goes back into her memory. But from then goes forward chronologically. So it more or less starts, an autobiography will generally more or less start with birth, go through the upbringing, the growing up, and then go through the key events of that person's active life, and probably not end with their death, because you can't really put your own death in your own autobiography. But there are some close exceptions to that. So we have more complete, more concrete, more chronological. And finally, an autobiography will tend to be written, or at least if it's published, it will tend to be written by somebody of some historical or cultural significance, as somebody who's somebody of whom the shape of their life in its entirety is inextricably enmeshed in the shape of the historical context or cultural sphere, cultural arena in which they find themselves. So you won't read too many autobiographies written by Joe Jim Bob, who works down at the local Burger King, who nobody outside his county has ever heard of. But you will read autobiographies of, presidents, athletes, famous artists, famous writers, famous musicians, a lot of politicians, a lot of key historical figures, as much as anything. And then you have memoir, which, to start off with, memoir, you'll see a lot more memoirs written by people who nobody has ever heard of, maybe before the memoir. So, for example, a famous writer named David Sedaris, maybe a lot of you have heard of him. He wasn't really he made his fame by being a memoirist. So he hadn't really done anything of much distinction before writing his memoirs, and that's kind of what made him famous. But there are tons of memoirs written by already famous people, or already culturally or historically important people. There's both. But the next thing that really divides memoir from autobiography in a more rigid way is that a memoir is written by someone about their own life. But it does not strive to tell the story of that life in its entirety. It's generally more partial. It'll focus on a specific event, a specific chapter, or specific thematically connected episodes. So it kind of fragments the life a little bit more. It separates it. So you might see like references to the person's birth, or references to other points in the person's life, but it doesn't strive to encapsulate everything. It doesn't strive to encapsulate the whole shape of a person's life. So that's one of the key things. You might, to contrast with autobiography, maybe say it's more fragmented. It's more partial. It's more of a zoom in. It also presents as more subjective, right? So as I said, there's no such thing as an objective autobiography, but it tends to present as being more objective. Whereas with memoir, it presents as subjective. There is more reflection. There tends to be more reflection. There's more of an assertion of perspective, right? So it's writing from within the life. Memoir basically is connected to the word memory. It's a memory story. So as somebody in the present, more pretty much reflecting on their memory from the present, and very overtly very offering a very overt perspective, very overt reflection, and a very overt subjectivity. And both a memoir and an autobiography, but a memoir more so because it's fragmented, is highly stiff. And that's really the first thing you need to start thinking about as you go into writing this paper is selection. The key is in the details that you select. So if you haven't figured it out by now, what you should be striving for in this 3 to 4 page essay is something more along the lines of memoir, because it would be absolutely absurd to try to write a full picture of your life in 3 to 4 pages. And many have tried in the personal narratives that I've seen in this class in the past. So you can't really do that. You can't really start with your birth and go through everything that's happened to you. You can reference things outside of the specific event that you're focusing on, or a small series of events if it's significant. So, if you were born in another country, say, and that's somehow significant, just for an example, you might reference that, but you don't want to start with your birth and then go through everything that brought you to this place. So the key thing is really, what are you going to select? What details from your life are you going to select? Which ones matter, first of all? Which are important to comprehending the narrative that you are trying to convey? And secondly, which ones matter in actually creating a narrative, right? So you want to select the details and events to talk about that represent some kind of dynamic in your personal, in yourself, right? You don't want to flatline. You want to create it doesn't have to be like super dramatic, but you want to be reflecting on something. You want an arc. You want a kind of story arc, right? And you can really achieve that by selecting the different details that contrast with one another, changes in mentality from point A to point B, or changes that you might have affected, not necessarily changes in yourself, but maybe something that you caused to change around you. And that's another way to go about it. There's tons of ways to do this, but the first question, first and foremost, is what details are you going to select? What events from the entirety of your life? Just a few, 3 to 4 pages is very short, so you're only going to get a few in. Which ones are you going to select to pull out and focus on? Which ones matter to the message you're conveying, and which ones actually form a vehicle for that message? Which ones form a story, a narrative? So that's what you have to start thinking about. So yeah, pretty much only reference what matters to the story. So I'll leave off with this video, and there will be another one coming. Hopefully you watched them in chronological order, but it's not a huge deal if you don't. There will be another video coming about writing this paper specifically. Until then, be well.